Good evening, everyone. I'm Charlie Kyle, the principal of Innis College, and I welcome you to tonight's event centered on Pure Flame with its author, Michelle Orange, and moderator, Pasha Malla. Before we begin, I will read the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this, I guess, the first event of 2022 at Innis College. And is not always the case. I have, if not a personal, at least a long-standing connection to the author in question. And I will say that I attended one of Michelle Orange's first book launches for her earlier essay collection. This is Running for Your Life, which I can hold up to prove that I have it. But also, if you want to get it, which I'm sure you will want to after you hear about her speak about Pure Flame. But my chief role right now, aside from remembering, and I've now remembered, to tell you that you will want to stay until the end because we will be giving out some free copies of Pure Flame. And even if you have your own, if you receive one, you may want to give it to a friend. That will happen at the end of the conversation between Michelle and tonight's moderator, Pasha Malla. And I will now introduce Pasha, and then we'll get going. So Pasha Malla is the author of 7 books, most recently, Kill Them All, a novel. His writing has won the Danuta Gleed Literary Award, the Trillium Book Prize, the Hamilton Literary Award, an Arthur Ellis Award, and several national magazine awards. And you might think that's more than enough for any author, but there is more. He's also been shortlisted for the Amazon.ca Best First Novel Award and the Commonwealth Prize, and longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the International Dublin Literary Award. Pasha takes all his awards and then puts them in his home in Hamilton, Ontario. So welcome, Pasha.
Thanks so much, Charlie. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to talk to Michelle about her really incredible book, Pure Flame. Definitely one of my favorite books of last year. And so I'm going to introduce Michelle now in turn. Michelle, I don't know who you're going to introduce, but
my dog.
Okay.
Although, what can be said, really?
I mean, if there's more awards to win, she'll get them. Michelle Orange was born and raised in London, Ontario. She's the author of This Is Running for Your Life, as Charlie said, a collection of essays, which was named Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker and The National Post, among others. Her writing has appeared in such publications as Harper's Magazine, McSweeney's, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Slate, and The Nation. A contributing editor and columnist for the Virginia Quarterly Review, Orange teaches in the graduate writing programs of Goucher College and Columbia University. And Michelle lives in New York. Coming to us live from New York City. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. I'm pretty good. I'm excited to.
You left out all my awards. I don't know. I don't know how to.
Well, you're probably actually modest, and you don't put them in your bio.
No, I just don't have any.
Yeah.
Someday.
Yeah. Okay. So the book is. I mean, the book is about many things, and we're going to get a chance to hear Michelle read from the book a little later. And I hope some of this conversation, for those of you who haven't read the book, will intrigue you enough to buy a copy and read it. At its heart, I think, it is a memoir, but it's also an incredible cultural study and a really beautiful and moving portrait of a relationship. But I want to kind of backtrack to, the first fact in your bio, which is that you're from London, Ontario. And there's a lot about London in the book, as it's where you grew up. And what I wanted to do is just start by sharing a painting. I didn't do it. Jack Chambers did it. This is the 401 towards London #1, I believe. And let's see if I can wrap my head around the tech specs here and do this. Just so if anyone, this painting is huge. What is this? It's like, 6 feet by 6 feet or something like that, or in those proportions anyway. And this is a view looking, I guess, westward along the 401. This is the exit to Woodstock, Ontario, looking back towards London. So for anyone who's from London, spent time in London, or familiar with London, this kind of vista is one that's common. And so Chambers, and I learned this actually in your book, Michelle. So Jack Chambers painted this after he had a oh wow moment where he was driving to Toronto and looked in the rearview mirror and saw this image and realized he had to kind of reconstitute his whole painting process. And you mentioned the painting in the book, and your mom, who is a large focus of what the book is about, as well as your grandmother, was quite a fan of Jack Chambers. And I feel like there's something in this image, and I just wondered if we could talk about it a little bit, as someone who left London, moved to Toronto, now has moved to New York, and occasionally does still return to London. Like, what is it about this image? Like, does it speak to you in some way? I find it really captivating myself. There's something about it too, where I think people who leave London are always looking back over their shoulder or in the rearview mirror. Do you want to say anything about this before we dig into the book proper?
Yeah, I just described this painting in the book. It's not one that my mom mentioned or was a favorite of hers, although she started collecting Jack Chambers images in the mid 70s, when through this period that she later described to me as sort of coming into her own tastes, her own handle of her own money, and feeling that in her early 30s that she was going to in some way have to start over. And that's one of the starting points of the book. But that image in particular, I think I share your sense of, it's capturing of something particular about London, even though London doesn't really figure in it. It's someone driving away from London. I was taken with Chambers when I looked into his backstory of having left London, going to Europe, going to make it as an artist, going to do all the breaks into Picasso's, compound and invents all, going to paint in a new way to, painting in the 60s, trying to make his way. But then he returns to London and starts a family. And it's there where I think what became his best known work was made. And it was all these landscapes of London or parts around London and these very domestic landscapes. So I was intrigued by the idea of an artist, and in one way we have this idea of artists who have to leave home in order to see it more clearly. An artist who actually had to go back home and live in this place. And it was that process to me. There's something very dreamlike about that image, even though the young woman who's helping out tonight asked when she first saw it if it was a photograph or a painting. To me, it has that intersection of, or sort of hyper realism with this dreamlike quality. I think that for me, I don't know about you, it speaks to something about how I feel about London and how I feel about a home. As I mentioned in the books, that almost all of the dreams that I have are set in my house in London, the house that I grew up in. I don't know. What's your feeling about it?
Yeah, I don't know. There's this line. There's one of the group of seven, they're allomaxims. They have these sort of like statements of purpose. And there's one that I feel like really resonates with me and this image, and it's the great purpose of landscape art is to make us at home in our own country. And I feel like, there are these images and, and books and all kinds of artwork that help us do that, right? That make us more able to feel at home. And to me, like, it was a theme that kind of ran through your first book of essays and that you've returned to here. And it's this kind of intersection of home and nostalgia as like two very strong kind of thematic threads. And I just wondered if we could talk about that a little bit. I mean, you've mentioned how, preoccupied your dream life is with the idea of home, but I was just wondering how home and nostalgia sort of intersect in this book. And what that process was like of like writing about this place that was home and, the people who are associated with that place.
Nostalgia. I think with this book, I spent a lot of time trying to understand my mom's relationship to London, almost more so than mine. And the way that she fixated on Chambers, for instance, and these qualities that we're talking about in his work, and my not really understanding until very recently what those qualities might have meant for her. London as a place that, I mean, I came to see it. I came to feel about London as a sort of a site of my mom's betrayal or disillusionment to some extent. You know, a young woman getting married in the 60s and moving with her husband for his job to London, which they did. My dad got a job at Western as a professor, setting up a first home and starting a family. I think my mom had a lot of ideas about, as most people do, and stories that she'd been told and told herself about what life was going to look like. And London seemed to be a perfect container for all of those things. There's sort of like a pre-nostalgized, space that she, had a lower middle class upbringing. Didn't really have a home growing up. Lived in her apartments with her family, but didn't own a home. So all these ideas about home ownership and family and all the things that were part of her 50s upbringing, London seemed to be the place that was going to finally hold all of that in a way that was real, and it just didn't work out that way. So through and so I chart some of her changes in the book. She returned to get a master, an MBA in her late 30s, early 40s, and started a business career after having two little children, and eventually took a job in Toronto and commuted home to London through some of those years, but was basically gone at that point and was on a different trajectory, and came to have a very complicated relationship with London as a city that had really let her down, but also still attached to it, still attached to everything that it could have been. And for some fleeting moment, I suppose, of her life, it was. Oh, you're muted.
You think after 2 years of doing this for hours every week,
I know.
It's just
I did
amazing.
it earlier.
Anyway, sorry about that. There's a line in the book, you write, what is there to say about London? And it's like an ironic statement. I also grew up in London, familiar with a place that's kind of hard to write about. For what reasons? Like, how would you explain if you were to try to describe London, Ontario? And we're going to move on. We're not going to just sit on London.
You just want to talk about London?
No.
What just came to mind when you said that is that I think even the people that live there overlook it as a place. It's just sort of, and maybe that has something to do with just seeing it as a container for all of your hopes and dreams about living a middle class lifestyle. I think that's what London is for offers for a lot of people who might want to bring up a family. But to do that is to sort of blink yourself in a way to the fact that you're in a specific place that has specific features, and that is not just a sort of nice place to live and raise your kids. And so it just seems to slide through people's imaginations. And when you ask them, like I'm thinking specifically of when I did some reporting around the young men who all grew up in London and went on to have some involvement in a terror plot in Northern Africa. And when the reporters started moving around London, asking people like, can you believe it? These young kids just from London are involved in this horrible thing that left dozens of people dead. And, no one had anything to say about, it's just like London. It's just like a sort of non-place, and how could this happen here? How could London have any connection to it? The sort of regular cliches. But yeah, I found it incredibly difficult to try because I'm no different. I've even though it inhabits so much of my dream life and it does have a place in my imagination, there's a sort of shape shifting where it slips out of my grasp every time I try to actually bring it back to life as a place in something like a written work.
Yeah, it's in some ways cosmetically, such an anodyne sort of place. But I think it was you who told me that it has the highest rate of serial killers in North America.
I might have told you that. Yeah, either that or you told me. Yeah.
Okay, we can move on from London.
Okay. So, can I just stop though? I because I feel like I didn't say thank you to Charlie for having me, and how much it means to me just to, as we're talking about London and Toronto and coming and going. And Charlie was my very first professor, my very first year at U of T. And I remember many, many things about that class. But I'll just say that the first thing that I remember is that I think he spent the first 15 minutes trying to convince whoever didn't belong there to leave. Like this isn't some bird course that you're going to take and just sort of tick off the boxes and come watch movies. This is serious business. And of course I stayed, and it really was one of those moments that changed my life. I went on to major in film, along with English, and just had such a wonderful experience at Innis. So it means so much to me, to be here. I wish I could be there, but yeah, just wanted to say that. Sorry.
No, that's, of course. So your relationship with your mom and your grandma and your mom's life and eventual illness provide a sort of shape to the book. And the book begins with somebody named Janice Jerome. Could you talk a little bit about who Janice Jerome was, or is, I guess, still, and why that was the point of entry for you? I mean, maybe not the point of entry in the writing process, but it's our point of entry as readers. Like, what is it about that person? Why is that the first name we kind of encounter on page one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't land on that as the point of entry until fairly late in the process. But Janice Jerome is the name, a pseudonym for my mom. And she is the sort of lead character of a business case that one of my mom's old professors at the Western Business School used to write about my mom's story. So what happened to my mom after she graduated with an MBA in 81, she got a job at London Life. I'll just say it as an big insurance company, and was there for a year or so. Someone was hired who didn't have an MBA. I think he was a economist or an actuary or something like that. Same job, doing the same job as my mom. And it just so happened that her boss had asked her to do some paperwork, and she had come across a spreadsheet with everyone's salary. And she learned that this fellow who'd recently been hired and was doing the same job was being paid significantly more than she was. So she went to HR and asked for equal pay, and was told no, and asked a couple more times and was told no. And a consultant who had come through London Life had floated the idea by her that there was a job that if she wanted it in Toronto. So in the Janice Jerome story, this is all transposed. Various details are changed. She's in Montreal. She's not in London, Ottawa. 3 kids instead of 2. My brother and I were quite young at that point. And there's a sort of the cliffhanger that the Janice Jerome case presents is, should Janice take this job? And should she move to this other city for much more money? They actually don't play it as a gender question at all. I was going to say she hit the glass ceiling, but she's not going to move forward in this company. And what they found when they brought this study into business classes, and I think it was initially meant to be a study about management and how to retain good employees, was that arguments were sort of breaking out among the students about Janice is horrible. How could she do something like this? A lot of the acrimony being based on her gender. Like what a selfish bitch, basically. Like that she how could she do such a thing? Of course she has to stay where she is, and she should not take the job. And so based on that response, the professors changed the case a bit, and they kept Janice, but they also made a Jack Jerome. And then they would split the class into 2 sections and have them, one section would read Jack, one section would read Janice. The story was exactly the same, just the pronouns were changed. And then they would answer a series of questions about, evaluating this person and what they should do, what was their character, what decisions should they make. And then they would reconvene all together, and it would sort of be revealed that this was the same person. They just changed the gender, and it became a kind of gender study. I didn't learn about the Janice Jerome story until about 2 years before my mom died. She just mentioned it in passing when we were talking about something to do with my life and my sort of work stuff and money stuff. And she just mentioned it very casually in the midst of these conversations that we've begun having more and more about her decisions, early in life and at that point in life in particular, in career and money. And she sort of mentioned her as though I knew of her, and I knew of this thing that she'd done, which is lend her story, to this business case. But I didn't, and she told me to Google it, and I did. And I begin the book with it, I think, because for me it was so suggestive of my mom's contradictory personality, her extreme privacy, but also her need to have her story known and sort of respected. That's one reason. There's a number of reasons, but I felt it was a good starting point because it helped me lay out a bunch of thematic questions that I had about my mother, who was both, if anything, I thought I knew all too well who my mother was, and on the other hand, I just had no idea who she was as a person. And so finding out that she had this other self out there made me wonder how many other versions of her there were out in the world that I just had never met and maybe never would.
And in some way, the book, I guess, is an attempt to reconcile those different versions, and your version and her own version, and various iterations of those versions. And one of the things, just listening to you talk about that, and you said the word story, and there's so much about storytelling, and there's a lot of stories in the book, but there's a lot of there's a line, for example, like from your grandmother's funeral, that there's a line, there were no stories at Rita's memorial. And I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about how much the book is a kind of attempt to write the unwritten story, or an attempt to offer a counter narrative to various other narratives. Like, was that a sort of impetus for you, like this absence of certain stories, or what was your process like, sort of engaging with those things, with storytelling, I guess?
Yeah, a conflicted one, because my relationship to story is conflicted, but it's definitely true that one of the things, especially as I was just starting out, the book changed a great deal because my life changed a great deal, and my mom became sick and ultimately died during the writing of this book. So the book had to shift and change to accommodate that. But certainly in the very early stages, it was the absence of stories about, what Adrienne Rich calls the mother-daughter cathexis. She calls it the great untold story. We had, I think there were a lot of cliches about mothers and daughters. I think there were a lot of sort of reductions and simplifications of what that bond is and what it can constitute. But the question of what, especially within this context of, let's say, a century of incredible feminist progress for women's rights, this question of what passes between a mother and a daughter, generation on generation on generation, has been reconfigured and pressurized and complicated in ways that I think we're really just beginning to reckon with. And that's not to say there are no mother-daughter stories. Of course there are, but I certainly didn't grow up with that as a sort of, I didn't have a narrative framework for so much of what was happening in my life. And a big part of what was happening in my life was my relationship with my mother, but I didn't see it that way. And I think in part because I hadn't been taught to by all of the stories that I've been exposed to, from the moment I was born. I wasn't taught to value it, to see it as significant. Certainly not in the ways that I've come to see it as significant in terms of shaping every part of who I am and how I've individuated and entered the world. So that was the absence of those stories was something I wanted to explore and write into and sort of weigh the consequences of, both, in the cast as large a net as I could, but also, of course, in my own life and my own maternal line, but I'm also deeply skeptical of the stories that we tell generally. So it was just sort of push pull within me, and I think within the book in that regard.
Yeah, and there's another sort of line much later in the book where you talk about, sort of realizing at some point what your mom's job was, like quite late in life, that it was that she worked in marketing, and the line in the book is, marketing I understood as a specific form of storytelling hinged on visions of the future and a refusal of the past. And I thought that was such a, like, to me, where it occurs in the book is like things like that relationship is really starting to crystallize and shift. And it's also when in the book, there's a lot of kind of transcriptions of text message conversations that are, I hope it's okay if I say amazing, at times. And it's like, it becomes this sort of like multi-textual portrait. Like it sort of shifts into like a mode of storytelling that feels like almost like kind of cubist or something. Like we have the sort of her telling you stories and then you telling her stories, and then the texts sort of filling in a different perspective. But I was just wondering about this kind of relationship here. And this kind of returns to what I was talking about in the beginning with this, like the kind of excavation of the past, or that a lot of what your essay writing and your storytelling seems to do is like engage with like questions of nostalgia, if not actually like participating in nostalgia, but just like looking at it. And I think, in your book of essays was the first place I ever read like a really good study of like what nostalgia is and how it functions. So, but I was just wondering about like this, realizing that your mom was a professional storyteller, and her, and also her relationship within story to time, like that the way that marketing works is, as you say, a vision of the future and a refusal of the past. And like how does that sort of square with what you do as a writer? Like, is your writing more past focused? Is it about excavating the past? And like, it's kind of an open-ended question, but I feel like there's just something there that you can make sound smarter than I have just now.
Oh man. Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, for so long, I didn't know what my mom did. It's the same. I think most people, when they hear the word consulting, it's just like, just washes over you and you think of something else. And my mom did some consulting, but even in her role, I would just say she was a businesswoman, and I didn't know what that meant. So it was a very long time before I understood that a lot of what she did, in my opinion, could be described as marketing work. And her sort of pastlessness or lack of interest, what seemed like a lack of interest in storytelling in the past to me was, I think I did go in that opposite direction of, I spent so much of my childhood focused on the past, even though I was a child. I was very interested in my family's mythology, especially on my father's side. And perhaps to some extent, this need to explore the nature of nostalgia and the impulse behind nostalgia stems from that, and it in some way was in reaction to my mother, because I have a line in the book about resenting having being deprived of story as a child, as a chef might resent being raised on gruel. It's sort of like that absence it made me as a writer, I think in many ways, and I mean, the best way I can say it is I think it created that push and pull that I described between both craving and needing story, perhaps even more than most people, and having a deep skepticism of it and almost a fear of it, or at least certainly a fascination.
Something else that I, was hoping that we could actually hear you read a little bit about in the book, or from the book, was there's a lot about bodies, like just your mom's body, your mom's sort of existence physically in the world, and then obviously when she becomes sick, what happens to her body. There's just one line I wanted to just talk about, like very briefly, and then I was going to ask you to read a little passage. So the line is, I kept a safe distance from the woman who built up her body with shoulder pads and heels, drawing closer when my mother wore a clean face, a nightgown. And, you talking about sort of like the past, the future, there's so many of these kind of binaries in the book. And to me, like the writing happens in these kind of interstitial spaces between them. And I wondered if you were able to kind of reconcile like the physicality as it's embodied in kind of like the physicality in this little bit that I read, but just like maybe even just those two versions of your mom as are sort of captured in this, in what she's wearing and when she's wearing it and when you wanted to stay away from. Was the writing of this book, and did you find yourself able to do that, like to figure out some space between the two that was like incorporated both?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but I think that part of the work was trying to understand that they were the same person, and to have more, to feel, to add more dimension to the one who was further from me, the one who was always leaving, with the makeup and the outfits and this sort of drive to move forward and move away and not look back. That it was the same person, like it's a different version of what we're talking about in terms of, wanting to leave, wanting to stay, loving London, feeling like London betrayed her. We all have versions of that within us, the turning towards something means turning away from something else, and trying to understand my mom's decisions and trying to see her as a whole person definitely meant trying to find a bridge between those two people. And I think the relationship that my relationship to my mother's body is a part of this story. It sounds strange to hear myself say it, but it's true. And in her illness, that relationship became, it deepened and complicated and made painful in a way that was, also something I'm grateful for, something that helped that process that you were describing along.
Would you mind reading the passage that I asked you to read?
Sure.
Thank you so much. I think the only thing that maybe you need to set up is who Jerry is.
Oh, Jerry. Jerry is the woman, it's not her actual name, but Jerry is the woman who ran she's an esthetician in Toronto. And during the years that my mom was commuting, and then for long after that, she would see this woman on a regular basis. My mom was very into self-maintenance and what is now called self-care, manicures, pedicures, and all of that stuff. So I've got a passage in here that talks a bit about Jerry, who became a wonderful friend to our whole family. On my rare teenage visits to Toronto, my mother often sent me to Jerry for cleaning up. My nails, my hair, they were never right. An esthetician with her own business, Jerry was tall and blonde, reminding me a bit of Bets. Bets was the woman who looked after my brother and I when we were young. Jerry called me sweetie and my love. She held my hands. Sawing at my fingertips, she would praise my mother's stamina, her strength and sacrifice. And I would seethe, finding the whole transaction bogus. Beauty for money, money for beauty. An exchange of abstractions, a form of intimacy that proposes comfort but can't provide it. In my giant combat boots and oversized clothes, I appeared to reject the beauty norms my mother observed with fierce discretion. In many ways, I suffered more acutely in my relationship to those norms than my mother ever did, perhaps because she was beautiful according to the prevailing standard, but I don't think so. Questions that tormented me seemed for her long settled, if not beside the point. To be feminine was not an act of submission, but a form of play. To look after one's appearance was both obligatory and a source of fulfillment. Saturdays with Jerry formed the apex of my mother's week. Theirs was her most consistent relationship through her career-building years. The exchange between them was also more complex than I understood when, as a teenager, I submitted in loaded silence to beautification, to Jerry's mothering touch. The combination was new to me. My mother kept my hair cropped as a girl. I learned about makeup at preteen sleepovers. The shock of my own image in the mirror, after a friend offered to line my eyes for the first time, has never fully left me. Atop a narrow staircase in a fancy Toronto neighborhood, Jerry often worked alone. She started her business in the mid-'80s, just as my mother arrived in town. In time, she hired others, added services, began selling her own line of skincare and cosmetics. My mother was eager to support Jerry, an entrepreneur raising 4 children, in the same way she had insisted on contributing to a pension for Betts. The struggle to enter and perhaps transcend the middle class was the one she knew best. It touched her in a way other struggles did not. Rita, my mom's mom, who never inhabited that class with the ease her daughters would, always found the resources to support her weekly wash and set at the salon. In style and careful grooming, there was not simple vanity nor enslavement to a beauty myth, but a measure of self-respect, an act of privacy and of restoration, a statement of persistence. Though it took place under the banner of beauty and at the risk of frivolity, across decades and in different ways for each of them, what transpired between my mother and Jerry was a matter of survival. Years later, as their bond began to loosen, my mother and I stood beside a casket holding the body of Jerry's 21-year-old daughter. A group of girls sat at the foot of the coffin, playing the Spice Girls' Viva Forever on repeat. The story we heard involved pills, a moment of black decision, then panic. She died on my 33rd birthday. My mother asked me to accompany her to the wake. It had been 14 years since Jerry buried her twin boys, infants who survived only briefly after birth. In the windowless funeral parlor, her presence was awesome, enormous, deranged. A blur of motion, she spun from person to person, at one with the room, seeking its axis. Lodged inside ourselves, my mother and I stood slanted and dumb. At some point, Jerry approached us, her eyes wild, and told my mother she looked fabulous.
That's some good writing there, Michelle. Yeah, I wanted you to read that passage because it touches on so many key themes of this book. One of which is loss, obviously, and the negotiations of loss, that various losses that happen throughout the book in various forms, not just of people, but of, positions and identity. And but the other thread is beauty, which is, throughout the book, and particularly in relation to your mom's beauty and her beauty regimens and routines and upkeep. And there's a real, the way that you capture it, there's like a real, it doesn't feel like vanity in the book. It feels like a genuine kind of pride, not like a hubristic pride, like something really kind of like awe-inspiring. And toward the end of the book, there's a moment where, you write about how your mom sort of like reaffirms your own beauty to you. And I found that moment quite touching. And then even further toward the end of the book, you say, that the book ends on this sort of note of change, that you write that you feel that there are many things about to change. And I wondered, if the character of Michelle, the teenager and her docs, clomping around and like a kind of like, physical refutation of her own beauty. Like, have you been able to personally reconcile that a little bit more? I know you hate this question. We talked about it, but I'm asking it anyway.
Wow. First of all, I never wore docs. I was too hardcore for docs. I went to Novaks and got the real, hand-me-down combat boots. So let's be clear. This question. It's funny. I thought you mentioned that moment where my mom asked me why I never thought I was beautiful, and I included it in the book. She's very ill at that time, and she's almost delirious due to what's going on with her body. And it was, part of me feels like if you're a mother asking your daughter that question, the answer is kind of in the question. It felt very loaded for me. And it's true that my mom's relationship to beauty, part of what I wanted to explore was this, the fact that for so long I was unable to see the intersection between us and our relationship to beauty and beautiful things. And so, when you asked me this question earlier, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think part of it for me was what I saw as my mom's disproportionate love of beautiful things, beautiful objects, material things, and my taking personally that relationship and seeing my mom that her relationship to it as lesser, because he was more interested in possessing beauty and beautiful things, whether rightly or wrongly. That was my idea. Whereas I thought of myself as someone who was interested in, extracting, wrestling beauty, out of myself and giving it to the world, as though I were somehow, less vain than her or anybody else. So I think part of my a certain phase of our relationship, and certainly in writing this book, was just seeing how alike, or at least how little difference there is between those two relationships, that we both loved beauty, and beauty played an outsized role in both of our lives. We're not opposites in that regard. The idea of feeling on the precipice of all sorts of change at the end of the book. I hadn't thought of it in quite that way, but I don't think you're wrong.
I have one more question and maybe a potential follow-up question, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So if anybody has questions for Michelle, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A tab. So you can just click on there and you type your question in, and then I'll vet them. And if I like them, I'll read them to Michelle. Please, that we'll open that up in about, I don't know, as soon as Michelle and I are done talking about this last thing. Does that sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Toward the end of the book, while your mom is still alive, you give her a version of this book that you've been writing the whole time to read. And the way that you capture her response is, not the whole book, I think it's a passage from it, isn't it?
Yeah. Small, yeah.
Yeah. But enough that she read again, then one more time, her disappointment turning to alarm, and finally a low, bleak simmer. Her tone over text was subdued. Maybe her feedback would prove useful. Everyone has their own truth, but to be a true story, she wrote, this one needed work. So I don't know if you want to talk about how that felt and what that process was like of sharing this thing that you've been working on for a long time with your mom, and her sort of, approaching it critically is maybe euphemistic, but so I'm interested in that. But then I'm also interested in what then changed about the book after her response to it. Like, did you do things differently? Did you, reimagine parts of it, or how the whole thing was going to function?
I definitely did, not because of that. I after she died, I'd handed in a first draft of the book, what turned out to be exactly a month before she died, and then I didn't touch it for another 6 months, and then I just sort of basically tore it up and started over. But I think the bulk of the passage that she read stayed intact. It was the scene where we go walking on St. Clair, to get a pedicure, and she's talking about her favorite sister from high school. At least that was one of the passages, and I'd chosen it because I thought it was this sort of anodyne, charming, trying to capture this vibe that we've been able to develop between us, which was so new for us. And she really didn't respond well. And in retrospect, I think, my mom, this was about a month after she'd been told she was dying, and she was in palliative care, and she'd been asking me if I would share part of this book that she knew was happening. So no, in that part, she asked me to change the name of the sister, and I did, but that was the only thing that I changed, because I didn't agree with her, and I thought, I took the spirit of her comment very, very much to heart, but because the spirit of it was, you're not seeing me whole, you're not seeing me correctly, and it wasn't so much about. I think ultimately I understood what she was saying, and I'm sure I'd feel the same way if someone was writing about me. But yeah, I didn't change very much in that particular passage.
Well, isn't every writer's great dread that someone will write about us?
Oh, yeah.
more than normal people.
No, I would not be cool about it at all.
Yeah. I guess I just, before we just go to the Q&A, I was wondering, if, after this, I mean, the book has been out a year-ish?
It came out in June, so
not quite a year. 8 months. No, who can do math? It's been out a while. And obviously, I know you've been writing other things and onto other projects. And I just wonder if this book felt like something that you needed to write through in order to be done with it, or if there are things about this book that still feel unfinished that you feel like you might treat in future projects.
That's a very good question. And I do feel like I'm finished. I mean, I say that now, but, this was so consuming and took up so much of my life. And, without, people will like the book or not like the book, but I feel that I got it right, and has given me a lot of peace. As I just said, the comment from my mom was devastating to me. I was wrecked. And once I decided to continue with the book after she died, it was a mission. It was like nothing I've ever gone through before as a writer, and nothing I've ever written. And I did feel like I needed to get this behind me, and getting it right was the only way that was going to happen. And I'd been writing because this book coincided with my mom's illness and death, and there were a lot of stops and starts. And I'd been writing freelance critical pieces all alongside it. And the things that I'd chosen to write about were very much intertwined with what the book was about. So, a lot of my VQR writing had to do with mothers and daughters and mother-daughter narratives and mother-daughter movies. And I'd gotten so much of that out, writing about Chantal Ackerman and it's career woman films. And anyway, I'd been so immersed in this subject for so long, not to not to make no comparison at all, but I think of Virginia Woolf after she wrote To the Lighthouse, just saying that she had finally kind of purged herself of this thing that she'd been circling in different ways for her entire writing career. And when she finally wrote the book, she was kind of done. And there's something very sad about that. After the book was published, I experienced a really profound wave of grief that I didn't see coming. And then I think I'd been holding off by clinging to the book for quite a while. And now I'm on the other side of that.
I have a million more questions, but that's fair to the people who are waiting. So there's one question in the Q&A, but prior to that, someone sent one in previously, and it was just somebody asking about the title, Pure Flame, how you came to, land on that as the title, and which I'm interested in too, is your answer.
Yeah, so the title is taken from a line from Susan Sontag's The Volcano Lover, and it comprises the epigraph of the book. Indeed, I did not think of myself as a woman, first of all. I wanted to be pure flame. And I've been working on the book in its very early stages for 6 months or so. And I had a working title that was a different title. But, sorting through different ideas and different frameworks. And I just happened to be reading the Sontag book. And when I came across that line, I was having a conversation with my friend about it and why it was resonating with me. And I was trying to explain, in that very sort of early way that you do when you're starting to work on something. And I quoted that line to her, and it was my friend who said, well, that sounds like a title, Pure Flame. Something about it captured my mother to me, this idea of someone who, to go back to the question of evading stories, and to me, an identity is just a kind of story. And my mom, both being attracted to this idea of being a wife, being a mother, being a homeowner, being beautiful, and being repelled by it or finding it too limiting, and wanting to be pure flame. And I don't know, a lot of her story, and to some extent my story, and then this larger contextual framework I wanted to bring in seemed nicely bound up in both that phrase and that sentence, I should say, and then in just the words pure flame.
I think it's a great title.
Thank you.
Andrea Williams is wondering, did you always feel that you would be able to finish and publish this book after your mom was gone?
No, I didn't. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. I really didn't. I struggled, and I was late with my first draft because my mom was dying. And like I said, I thought I'd handed it in, and she was so excited, and we were, for a lot of that time, the question was, is my mom going to be able to read this book? She started referring to it as our book, and obviously I very much wanted her to, but it was also boggling the process for me, so and so I finished a draft, but it wasn't good. It was a totally different book. I didn't know where I was in it, what it just didn't work. And then she died, and I think so. No part of me ever gave up, but I didn't know how to move forward. And like I said, it took a period of months of just stepping away from it. And then having a conversation with my agent where she sort of floated the idea of not finishing it. And something about that, made me furious and sort of like lit the, I just remember leaving, getting on the subway, and like suddenly it was like the floodgates opened, and I was like, I'll show everybody, like I'm going to do this. Like, I'm not going to be beaten. I needed to write this book. And I needed to figure out how to write it. And I finally sort of felt like I was, I think you become the person before you can write the book. You have to become the person who can write it. And I think I was close enough to that, to do it. And I just went into a frenzy of, 5 or 6 months of, what's that Homeland character with the, the Post-its and the string? It was like that. I went full Homeland, but only after a long period of very painful inertia.
Does anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to type them in the Q&A. While we're waiting for that, I wondered if you had any recommendations for other books, novels or nonfiction books, that you feel are interesting, accurate, whatever, but portrayals of mother-daughter relationships that you found helpful while you were writing this, or you've read since that you really enjoyed?
Not one mother-daughter, which is Fierce Attachments, which was the Vivian Gornick book that I'd read years ago. And then it's almost like, I don't know about you, when you're writing a book, there are certain books that I have like under glass, like I can't, it's only in the case of emergency, or the timing has to be right for you to revisit this particular book. So it was only after the moment that I just described where, I had this terrible meeting, and was launched back into work, that I was like, okay, now I can finally read Fierce Attachments again. It's not going to like mess with my like mojo too much. It's actually the right moment. And Heavy by Casey Lehman, which is a book written to his mom, was a book I read at that exact same time that just gave me so much. Another book, Susan Felude's In the Dark Room, about her relationship with her father and her father's transition late in life. I read just as I was beginning this book in earnest in 2016, and it's just an incredible nonfiction narrative book, and that blend of the personal and the contextual and historical research, and the deeply complicated relationship with her fathers is one I recommend to everybody.
You also mentioned Girl, or not, the Jamaica Kincaid, is it Annie John? Annie John,
yeah.
In the book, you talk about that. I mean, that's an incredible book. I guess it's linked stories. Okay, a couple more questions. Linda is wondering, and I'm wondering, Linda's wondering if you have any insights now that the book is published, and I'm wondering what kind of insights Linda's after, if they're hot tips about the publishing industry, or I don't know what to do with your millions. Like, Linda, if you could clarify what sort of insights, is that okay, Michelle? If we Because I would just love to know specifically what sort of insights you're after. So we'll look at Rob Kingston's question. How have the other members of your family received the book? It's personal and other people are impacted as well, I assume.
Yeah. My family's been extremely generous, and I feel very lucky about that, because I was very nervous. I've not written something quite this personal before. And it did implicate them and involve them. And it was their story as well to some degree. So my mom's husband, Frank, was the first person that I sent it to, because he was through the bulk of the illness, which takes up some space in the book. He and I went through that very much together to a great extent, and along with my mom's sister. So his opinion was one I was apprehensive about, and he was just incredibly generous. That's the word I would use. Everyone's been wonderfully generous, and I think glad to, because they know, at least some of our relationship and how very complicated it was. I think there was concern about that. What kind of book was this going to be, and this person that they loved was gone, and in some ways I'm handling her legacy. So I was very gratified by the response of my family.
Linda is wondering that now you're away from the book and you can't change it if you're seeing it through other lenses.
I wouldn't say so. No, I don't. No, it's. I just feel grateful to have the book, and grateful to have written it. If that doesn't sound strange, it was. I read it all the way through a couple of weeks after it was published, which you read it a bunch when you're going through edits and so on, but it's different when it's been published and you can actually just read it as a book. And I just felt glad about it, and willing to cede control in the way that you have to, and let it give it to the world, and hope that they think it's beautiful. And if they do, then it belongs to them and it's not mine anymore.
Yeah, I hear this sometimes of, writers, the book is out and there's like regret, or there's like all the sorts of publishing industry stuff that starts to weigh down on you. I think that doesn't make very many feel good.
That's different. Yeah.
That's a completely different thing. But I think the work, and also honestly, this is a book to be proud of. Anybody would be proud of having written this book. It's just like exquisitely beautifully written. I think I told you my dad was calling me and reading me sentences. It's like, dude, I know I've read it twice. I don't need.
You didn't tell me that.
Yeah, I did.
You did?
Yeah, I think I did. Or maybe I told you my mom was doing the same, because they both were. Coming at me from both angles. To me, this is I don't know what else you could have done here. It just feels like so complete in what it is. The publishing.
Then the book is for you, not everyone's going to feel that way, and that's okay with me. I don't need that. I don't want it to be misread. I've seen you see reviews where you're like, but that's not even, and then you sort of get leave it alone. But if someone thinks it's beautiful, that's all I could ask. I don't need everyone to think it's beautiful.
Yeah. I think
just your family, just your immediate family is really.
My parents.
I'm good.
Yeah, my parents.
I could live on that for another decade.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any questions for Michelle. Please feel free to type them in the Q&A. Michelle, is there anything else you'd like to? That no one didn't get it. Well, that's good. Great. Michelle, is there anything else you want to say? Is there anything you want to ask people? I don't know, the universe, the Zoomverse?
No. I just want to say, thank you to you, Pasha, for doing this and being so generous with your time, and how it could only be better if I could be back at Ennis Town Hall in person. It means a lot to me to, as I said, Ennis was a big part of my formative writing years, learning how to essay, how to write about film and enjoy it. So
we have a final
grateful.
question that's the classic closing question that every writer loves. What are you working on now?
What am I working on now? I'm working on a cycle of essays that is still sort of coming together. I don't know if it's a title, but the phrase that goes through my head when I think about the banner that it falls under is on looking and on looking away. So that's as far as I can go, really. But I'm finally getting into it. It's taken me a while. Like I said, the publishing is its own set of disorienting circumstances, but there really was a lot of grieving to get through that I wasn't anticipating after the publication process. So it's been an interesting fall, and I'm finding my footing just now about new writing. You know, I did feel really spent after this project, and it was a great feeling, but it was also just an empty feeling. I didn't know where to go next. So it's good to feel like I'm finding that.
I mean, and that surely must have been amplified by living in this, 40% existence that we've been living in.
Well, that's the thing. I finished the book in the first 4 or 5 months of the pandemic, and that was a godsend. And yeah, living through this without something to consume you every day and to keep you feeling like you're moving forward every day is rough. Like, it's not, relatively.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michelle. It was such a pleasure talking to you. And thanks to Ennis for hosting, and Charlie here.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Well, first of all, let me say that, Michelle, I sort of had ambivalence about your first memory because I was mortified to hear the thing I did before the class even started was to try to get rid of students. Sounds like
it was amazing. It was like a hazing. You lay down the law.
It sounds like an economics professor, but but I will say one thing is that I just wonder if I can't remember what the syllabus was at that point, but do you remember, was it a formative experience? Just say yes. If I showed Daughter Right in that course?
No, I don't remember.
Okay.
I don't think so. Citizen Kane was our first movie, and then we watched silent movies for the rest of the fall. I remember that. It wasn't until January that we got to
Oh,
talk.
I see. I remember. Yeah, that's a different structure of the course. Okay, so because if you haven't seen it, the one thing I will say, not even so much a question, but maybe a reflection on it, is when you were reading from the book, I was really struck by this kind of combination of tenderness and precision, but also a bit of detachment. And I realized that writing a memoir is, of course, it's filtering. The memories aren't that close because you're processing them twice, right? Once through the memory, once through the writing. And I felt like that really came through in your reading of it. So the reading really added a dimension to it that is quite touching. So
I'm glad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you everyone for coming. And I did promise that we would be giving away 3 of the books. So here are the 3 recipients: Nancy Kahn, Peter Tabbitt, and Judy Beauville. So congratulations to the 3 of you. If you haven't read Pure Flame yet, you have a delight before you. And I want to thank everyone, but before I do that, I'll close with my thank yous, but I'll just draw people's attention to the next 3 events that we have coming, all of them tied to Black History Month, and all 3 of them screenings. So on February 17th, we have One of Ours with the director Yasmin Mathurin. And then on February 24th, we have Akila's Escape with Charles Officer. And then on February 28th, so not a Thursday as you might typically expect, but rather a Monday, we have Beyond Moving with Vikram Dasgupta and the subject of that film, Sipe November. And some of you may know Sipe November as a dancer with the National Ballet. So he will also be present for that screening event. So a lot to look forward to. And I want to thank Writing and Rhetoric program first for collaborating with us on this. I should have said that at the outset. And then our team behind the scenes, Victoria Watson-Supchak, Ned Seeger, and Shayla Anderson. We're so grateful to the people who help us put this all together. And then finally, thank you to Pasha Malla for a wonderfully intimate and interactive session with Michelle, and of course to Michelle Orange, both for the gift of the book that she's written and for her gracing us with her dog from New York. And we also share your regret, Michelle, that you weren't able to come to Town Hall. Someday. We'll be able to do this in person, but who knows when. But for now,
we'll be together.
Yes, exactly. So thank you so much for this. It was delayed, everyone. We were hoping to do this earlier, but it was not to be. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charlie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.